Axios is just the beginning.
Hello, thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to our live stream audiences from Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, and on Axios.com. I am coming to you live from Falls Church, Virginia. I'm Kim Hart from Axios. Welcome to the Ethical Tech in Crisis virtual event. Today, we'll have a 30-minute event with 3 segments on how technology companies are responding to the coronavirus pandemic. We'll unpack how they are building ethical and responsible tech centered on privacy and transparency during a time of crisis. Thank you to our partner Salesforce for sponsoring this event. And please follow along using the hashtag Axios events, hashtag and at Axios on Twitter. For the latest news, please remember to check out our dashboard at Axios.com. First, joining us from Atherton, California, we have DJ Patil. He's head of technology at Devoted Health, senior fellow at the Belfer Center at the Harvard Kennedy School, and the former U.S. chief data scientist. Hello, DJ. Welcome to the program today.
Thanks for having me.
So, given your very deep history in both technology and data science, you clearly believe in the benefits that both technology and data can offer to the public. And my first question for you today is, from where you sit, how well has the tech sector been actually delivered on its promise to benefit the public during this pandemic?
So there's a number of places where technology has really surfaced and done some remarkable things. For example, one of the things that people don't realize is the number of people who just volunteered at the beginning of the pandemic, myself included. I was in Sacramento for about 15 weeks, helping out the California team. And in that process, we open sourced a novel set of technologies to help people understand, specifically the public health officers at the county level, understand what the models are saying. We work to build new models. And we really opened up a lot of data to help not only people build new models and understand the pandemic, but give more transparency and timely reporting data. Another quick one is that an organization was created called the U.S. Digital Response. And that organization has more than 3,000 data scientists and technologists who have raised their hands to say, I'm willing to take a leave of absence from their company to help out anybody who needs it on pandemic. And that's all around the United States and just free services to support governments. So we've seen a lot of great things. We've also seen a number of very challenging areas that I think we need to ask ourselves, if we look in the mirrors, are we okay with? The first and foremost is misinformation. And that misinformation is there is a tremendous amount of bad information, fake information, and downright information that's designed to skew our view of reality. That's around, is COVID real? Is it a hoax? Do masks harm us? The answer is no. It's okay to wear a mask and it's not going to hurt you. But the place that this really has a major issue is it creates public distrust at a time when we need it the most. And one of the areas that will likely, even if we get a vaccine, cause an issue is, will people trust a vaccine? And if we can't have we don't address those misinformation issues right now, we are going to have a far extended impact of COVID.
What do you think is the responsibility on the part of the platform companies, for example, when it comes to policing that kind of misinformation and disinformation? Is the onus on them to make sure that they remove that? Or are they doing a decent job on the fact checking? Or it sounds like you're arguing that there's some room for improvement there.
There's a tremendous amount of room for improvement. And I think for a long time, there's been a discussion of what is responsibility on the platforms actually look like. Who's responsible for moderating content? What does it actually look like to say this is okay or not? Previously, a lot of those conversations, we could try to take our time to try to. Right now, we don't have time on our side. As we get past 150,000 who are dead just here in the United States due to COVID, and the potential downstream impacts for people not coordinating on basic hygiene like masks or believing that there's even COVID is a potential issue, it's no small statement to say this is life or death. And so we have to, the platforms have responsibility right now to figure out what is the right level of action. At a bare minimum, it's creating stricter standards for how and what is allowed on their platforms.
And shifting it a little bit to another area where tech has been talked about a lot and has a huge role to play, obviously, is on their surveillance side, not only through contact tracing applications, but also when it comes to compliance with local ordinances and local orders, such as masks, wearing masks, or adhering to quarantine types of orders. How much of a role should the tech industry be playing in that? Should that really be government led or industry led? And what does the interplay look like there?
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad you brought this up, because there is so much fear and so much inability to get our testing in order and other activities. We're grasping for straws around how do we actually know if people are doing very basic things like wearing masks. And so as people see some of the really interesting technology that's there in machine learning and computer vision, people are really grasping to say, hey, why can't we just use machine learning to look at video footage and ask if people are wearing masks? When we ask that question, we know some of the answers that are already going to be there. How do we make sure that we have a good data set? How do we make sure that someone who is dark skinned and wearing a dark mask isn't counted the right way? And then what do we do in regards to enforcement? And we've seen that enforcement is not equal, especially as one population is disproportionately impacted. And we've seen that especially as we've realized that the Black population has disproportionately had adverse outcomes. So it's easy to say like this technology can be beneficial, but I have very serious reservations about it being deployed. And then what happens once it's deployed? Do we keep that in place after a pandemic? Those are the questions that we should be prepared to answer right now. All too often, people think, oh, this is not that bad. People forget that after 9/11, we had a very similar set of questions about the use of technology data in regards to national security questions. As a result, we enabled legally actions for the NSA and other groups. And then people realize later what the outcomes of that are with regards to impact to privacy.
What's the opportunity then for the tech sector? We're in this national crisis on multiple fronts. And I mean, there was always this, urging and kind of sense of we need to figure this out. We need to figure out how tech can be equitable, to be fair, to be unbiased. And now that we're in this situation where there's really no choice and the clock is ticking in a significant way, how can the tech industry capitalize on that pressure to actually maybe overcome some of these challenges, or finally, come to an agreement on the best way to move forward on some of these issues that you've just been talking about?
Well, I'm glad you brought this up. So if people are interested, I posted this on Medium and LinkedIn, my 6 recommendations for what to do about this. But the real quick version of this is we need to stop focusing on the super sexy technologies like machine learning and rather focus on the bare basics of Maslow's hierarchy of technology: food, clothing, water, shelter. And that is just even being able to get the basics data in from hospitals around COVID to get information about testing. How do we put that in a way that's accessible? How do we ensure that by default, any data around COVID is open and machine readable for everybody? And then once that's all in a place, how do we start actually getting better every single day about using that data to ask deeper, richer questions? Like once we get to those things, then we can move on to the other questions that are even bigger and more important.
So it's almost like we're at a back to basics moment, and we need to really get down to the core of what tech and data can actually help with before we try to get ahead of ourselves with algorithms and machine learning.
That's right. We have forgotten that we have not invested in public health in nearly a decade. And there's not been any investments in the super sophisticated, slick technologies that we're kind of used to on our mobile phone. And so the system is not designed to handle a pandemic. And by the way, this is not the last pandemic. This is only COVID. SARS-2. There are going to be other coronaviruses. There is still going to be a pandemic flu, and there's many other diseases that are coming. So we need to now invest in the infrastructure that is going to ensure that we have the ability to keep taking advantage of the technology to get ahead of this curve that allows us to beat these viruses.
And one last question for you, DJ. You mentioned that you had volunteered with the state of California to help with their pandemic response on the data side. If you could name like the top two things that state governments need when it comes to helping to build a better, more robust system when it comes to these technologies, what would it be? What are their biggest needs?
Number one is we need a national strategy. We're putting too much onus onto the states and subsequently the counties. Second is we frankly need people who have the great technology skills. My ask to them would be consider volunteering or consider joining the state government or county governments and actually making the system better. Take your skills, take your services, and consider serving.
Thank you. DJ Patil, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Up next, we have our View from the Top segment with our CEO, Jim Vandehei, and Chief Ethical and Humane Use Officer at Salesforce, Paula Goldman.
Thank you very much, Kim. It's now my pleasure to have a conversation with Paula Goldman, who has a much cooler title than any of you who are watching. Paula is the Chief Ethical and Humane Officer at Salesforce. What do you do? I've never heard of that before. Explain to people. Probably nobody's heard of that before. What is it, and is it new?
Yeah, it's a new role. And we're, increasingly seeing roles of this type in the tech industry. Basically, my job is to ensure we're thinking through the impact of our product in the world. So I do product policy, and I work with the product teams on how we design our product, all with ethics top of mind.
And this has been a role for how long at Salesforce?
Yeah, I've been at Salesforce for about a year and a half now.
Excellent. And is this common or uncommon in Silicon Valley? Like, would we find a lot of other chief ethical and humane officers?
So as far as I know, I'm the only chief ethical and humane use officer that's in tech right now. But we are starting to see companies create responsible innovation teams or AI ethics teams. And we know our peers really well, and we're starting to create a community and learn from each other, and learn from civil society and learn from all the people that really deeply care about this issue.
And Salesforce has done a lot related to COVID. You've been helpful in setting up a program to be able to take the inputs on contact tracing. How does ethical use of technology fit into that? Help somebody who might not be that familiar with that think it through.
Yeah, well, okay, so 2020 has felt like a decade probably, but so it's hard to remember. Before 2020, the tech industry was already kind of in a moment of crisis, an inflection point where people were looking at the question of responsibility in tech and the impact of tech in the world. And that's why we created an Office of Ethical and Humane Use, was to think through how do we design our products with all of our stakeholders in mind, and to make sure that our tech is beneficial for the world. Now, we did not predict a pandemic. We did not predict, the racial justice crisis happening at the same time in the United States at the same time as the pandemic. But luckily, we had been developing tools and processes to deal with it. And so, for example, when the pandemic struck, Salesforce started developing a technology called Work.com to help companies and communities reopen responsibly. And we jumped into action. The Ethical and Humane Use team jumped into action because we knew that in a pandemic, even though there's no definition of responsible tech for a pandemic, that we needed to think about things like privacy. We needed to think about how vulnerable groups were being affected. And so we worked really closely with the product teams on that type of stuff. Would it be helpful for me to give you some examples?
That'd be awesome. And like maybe even an example of like what irresponsible tech would be that responsible tech replaces. I assume it might mean some technology an algorithm could discriminate, but responsible technology would not.
Well, exactly. So the whole point is you're thinking like, who are we designing this for and with? And in the case of Work.com, where we're trying to help businesses reopen responsibly, we also want to make sure that they're thinking through the impact with their employees in mind. So for example, if you are, scheduling time to go back to work, you might get work.com enables you to get a survey, to send it to all of your employees and then to say, okay, do you have any symptoms? And we wanted to make sure that we're keeping health data really closely guarded. And so, if that survey, employers don't need to know specific symptoms that their employees have. They just need to know whether they're available to come back to work and are healthy. So all of that survey was designed super carefully. So that's just basically, yes, do you have any of these symptoms? Yes, no. We are really careful about who within the system gets to see that data. Strong controls, strong guidance for customers around that. I could go on, but in essence, the responsible technology comes down to two questions in my head. One is, who are you designing with and for? And two, these small design decisions that can make a massive amount of difference on someone's privacy, even on, someone's human rights. And we think about human rights a lot as we design our technology.
When you think about the system that you've been able to help create where people can input the data that they're picking up on who might have come in contact with somebody who has a coronavirus, what's an example of something that's responsible that had you not thought through could have been irresponsible or not necessarily safe for the consumer?
So I think you're talking about contact tracing, right? And we've all gotten a crash course during this pandemic of, this is contact tracing is an age-old best practice for public health professionals. And now all of a sudden we're you see cities and governments scaling up, hiring tons of people on how to do contact tracing. So one, it's important that this is done, when you're enabling human beings that are asking these questions, that they have a set of protocols to get the right information, to ensure the people that they're asking for this information, what's going to be done with it, who gets to see the data, and to assure them of privacy concerns. And so when we built out our own contact tracing, which is being used by many governments and also sometimes by companies, that there were these safety protocols built in, that there were, standard public health practices built in. And that's the kind of thing that makes a massive difference in the efficacy of this technology. The more effective contact tracing is, the more likely you are to save lives. But people only will use technology if they trust it. And that's sort of the whole thing. The pandemic hits and all of a sudden, trust becomes the most important thing with technology.
And how optimistic are you that this whole movement towards more ethical use of technology will outlast this moment? We just had the tech hearings in Washington, lots of questions about what people can do with your data. Is this a movement that people can believe in, or is this something that's going to require tremendous public pressure to keep alive?
Well, I'm a scholar of movements. I don't know if you know this, but I got a PhD. I studied how unorthodox ideas become mainstream. And what I would say is that this is definitely a movement, but we're in the early innings. And when we think about ethical use of technology at Salesforce, we know it's not just us. It actually requires civil society. It requires governments. It requires companies as well taking this seriously. And my effort, for example, is one small piece of a much, much bigger equation. So nothing is ever guaranteed in a movement. And everybody should really care about the impact of technology on our lives, because right now in a pandemic, it's life and death, right? And so I am optimistic that this work will keep scaling and that we will emerge. Just like, for example, 20, 30 years ago, we had a security crisis and we emerged with new protocols and tech about security. It's early days for ethical use. That's where we're heading, but we all have to keep working at it.
Paul, thank you for a fascinating conversation. Thank you to Salesforce for making this broader conversation possible. And over to you, Kim.
Thank you, Jim. I'd like to welcome our next guest joining us from Geneva, Switzerland, Kenneth Roth, who is the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch. Thanks for joining us, Kenneth.
My pleasure to be with you.
So one of the biggest projects that the tech industry has embarked on during the COVID-19 outbreak has been in the area of contact tracing, which provides apps on smartphones so that people who have been in the proximity of others who have been infected with the virus are able to be tracked down and notified that they've been exposed, and then therefore help prevent the further spread of the virus. Now, tell me a little bit about how Human Rights Watch is monitoring the impact of those kinds of applications from a human rights perspective.
Well, I think it's worth beginning to note that these contact tracing apps are not a panacea. They are meant to supplement human contact tracing. And there's going to be, no real substitute for the people involved who talk to others and follow up on the people who they might have been in contact with and might have infected. But these apps are a useful supplement. But the big question really is, to what extent do they respect privacy? And we can see what can go wrong by looking at the first country to adopt a contact tracing process, which was South Korea. And they had a very open process which gave almost no attention to privacy. They collected credit card data, they collected location data, they used facial recognition software and video monitoring, and they made all of this public. And it was an absolute disaster. People were ostracized because they were identified as coronavirus infectors. Marriages broke up because people saw where their partner were going. And so there was recognition that for these contact tracing apps to work, for people to adopt them voluntarily, which is critical to get the massive participation needed for it to be effective, they were going to have to respect privacy. And Google and Apple stepped in with a joint venture and produced an app that really, I think, is the gold standard with respect for privacy, with one caveat, which I can get to. But for example, if you look at what they did with location data, they said, in essence, we're not going to use location data. We're going to use proximity data, meaning they're going to use the Bluetooth capacity on different phones to say, when is one phone near another for some period of time, say 15 minutes, so that we suspect that there might have been an infection if one of those two people was infected. And that is much less intrusive than location data, because location data really pieces together your private life. There is, even if it's anonymized, there is only one person who goes from your house to your job. And you can then trace that phone every place else that the person goes in the course of the day. So by not relying on location data, this was a huge step forward in terms of privacy. Now, the Google Apple app did a few other things too that were respectful of privacy. They did not identify the infector. They simply told somebody that you were near somebody who was infected. They did not put the data in a central database that the government might use for other reasons, but they basically kept the essence on the phone. And they made sure that the data was not retained for longer than was necessary for contact tracing purposes. So after 2, 3, 4 weeks, it was deleted. It didn't just live in a database. And these, important steps to respect privacy made this app much more palatable to people, and they were much more likely to adopt it. Germany then was the first big nation to embrace this app, and many other governments are stepping forward. It really has become the gold standard in many respects for contact tracing apps.
And it still is a voluntary process, at least in the US. I know in other countries, they have made it more of a mandatory situation. But when it is voluntary like this, and especially in a place like the US where there are still a fair number of privacy concerns, how effective can this kind of an application really be from a public health perspective?
Well, you're asking a question which we're asking governments. Because, so far governments have not been willing to release data about how useful was this. Is it just a handful of people who've been identified as possibly exposed, or are we dealing with, large numbers? And of course, the answer to that question is also going to depend on the number of people who download the app, which, as I noted, is directly related to how well it respects privacy. But, as you get to, say, 60% of a population downloading the app, it can be quite useful. Never, a substitute for the personal contact tracing, as I mentioned, but it could be helpful. But we really have asked governments, tell us, given that there is still some intrusion on people's privacy, is it worth it? Are you getting enough out of this? Or is this just, throwing technology at a problem to pretend you're doing something? They're not doing that much, and we should just, not waste the time and effort on technology and focus on people and do the traditional contact tracing that they've always done. We don't really know the answer to that yet.
You mentioned that the Apple Google application is the gold standard, at least at this point. Are there things that the tech industry could be doing more of or be doing better to enable contact tracing or other kinds of ways to help people monitor how the disease is spreading and whether they're infected or not? Are there other things that you wish that the industry was doing?
Well, one thing that has come up is that it turns out that the Google version of the app used for its Android devices, you can only turn on the app if you also turn on your location data, your GPS monitor. And so while that doesn't necessarily go to the government, it goes to Google. And they haven't been able to divorce those two capacities. So that's a problem. Here we make this great advance. We're using proximity data, not location data for the app. But to get there, you've got to give Google all of your location data. So that needs to be solved. What's also coming up is that some governments, for example, Russia, are developing apps to monitor compliance with quarantines. And of course, they're trying to sell these, through Apple's and Google's app stores. And a number of these quarantine enforcement devices are, the case of Russia, what they basically do is they give you a quarantine order. They say, you've got to stay home. You've got to download this app. And we are going to send you text messages at various times of day, at which point you have to take a selfie and send it to us to show us that you're at home. But, they're sending texts in the middle of the night when people are asleep. Or sometimes, people don't know how to download the app. They're just not technologically savvy and they're getting fined. Some people have actually gone to the doctor to show that they've gotten rid of the virus. They don't need to be quarantined, and they get fined because they were on the way to the doctor to try to show that they no longer need the app. So when you have problematic uses of technology of this sort, Google and Apple shouldn't participate. They should say, we're not going to let you put apps like this on our stores if you're going to be using it in this highly abusive way.
So you're saying the onus is on the tech companies to understand how the government will be using this kind of information before they make it available to the public.
Absolutely. And the various app stores are really essential for getting these apps out to people, to putting them on the vast majority of devices that are available. And it's not enough for Google or Apple to just say, well, the Russian government asked us, so of course we're doing this. No, they should really be scrutinizing it. And if it is being used in the kind of abusive way that Russia has, and Human Rights Watch has reported on this, so it's very available, this information, Google and Apple should be saying, either fix this or you don't get to use our app stores.
Got it. And are you seeing an evolution in the attitudes of the public towards privacy and privacy standards as a result of the coronavirus pandemic? And are you seeing differences between different countries?
Well, I actually think that the evolution away from location data has been revolutionary, because before the pandemic, governments and businesses were just using location data despite its incredibly intrusive nature, despite the fact that it really reveals whole aspects of our lives. And even though it was in the midst of a pandemic, people were panicking, nonetheless, we've seen huge progress where, today it's just not acceptable to use location data as part of one of these contact tracing apps. So I hope that the progress we've made with respect to contact tracing will carry over into other aspects of life, so people recognize that an essential aspect of the right to privacy is not following people's location data around without probable cause, without real reason to believe that there is a crime being committed or some legitimate, demonstrable reason why governments or businesses need to get a hold of this data.
Great. Kenneth, Roth, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you all for joining us this afternoon for another virtual conversation that I hope has made everyone smarter faster. If you liked this conversation and would like to sign up for more Axios content, please sign up for any of our newsletters at signup.axios.com. Thank you again to our partner Salesforce for making this conversation possible. Also, if you are interested in getting up to speed quickly on the news of the day without having to use your eyes, check out one of our new podcasts. Our daily podcast gets you smarter faster in 10 minutes called Axios Recap and Axios Today, both at different times of the day so you can get your fix when you want it. You can sign up anywhere that you get your podcasts. Thank you again for joining us and have a wonderful afternoon.